All right, well, welcome everyone. Really delighted that you were able to join us tonight, and really delighted to have Mike Baxter with us tonight for this incredible event. My name is Bill Cavanaugh of DePaul University, and Mike deserves no introduction, as they say, but we're going to give him one anyway. He is the Director of Catholic Studies and teaches at Regis University in Denver. And a lot of you know he has a long experience in the Catholic peace movement. After an MDiv at Notre Dame, he co-founded Andre House Catholic Worker House in Phoenix and worked there for how many years, Mike? 4 years. Working with the homeless, doing social justice work, and then went off to Duke to get a PhD under Stanley Hauerwas, and that's where I got to know him. I think we had met in Mexico or Chile or somewhere before then, but had some wonderful years at Duke together in graduate school, including a very odd experience of going and working with conscientious objectors in Germany during the first Gulf War, getting to know some of the Green Party over there. And then Mike taught at Notre Dame for many years, including a course called A Faith to Die For, which became kind of legendary, had a big influence on a lot of students, and sent a lot of students, I think, from there into Catholic worker houses and other kinds of peace work around the country. And I think Mike has influenced people in part by his intellectual acumen, and in part by living what he's talking about. He founded, while he was teaching at Notre Dame, founded the South Bend Catholic Worker Community, which is really a thriving community with a number of houses, and the Our Lady of the Road drop-in center for homeless people there. And I think about a lot of different experiences with Mike. One of my favorites was driving up to the American Academy of Religion meeting in Washington when we were still in graduate school. And we were both giving talks as graduate students. And I asked Mike what he was going to wear, and he said, "What do you mean I'm going to wear? You know, whatever I'm wearing." I said, "No, come on, you're going to look like a grad student. So you gotta have a suit coat." So we pulled over, we found a Goodwill, and Mike bought a sport coat for $7 at the Goodwill. As you can see now, we've reached that point in our careers where we no longer feel like we need a sport coat to talk about peace and justice. So here we are. Let me thank everybody again for coming, and with that I will disappear and send it over to Mike. So the format for the evening is Mike's going to talk for about 25 minutes. Then we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to kind of interview him and prod him for a few more things. And then we will open it up for questions. And if you have a question, you can use the Q&A function. There's a lot of people that are tuned in, and so if I don't get to your question, please don't be offended, but I'll get to as many questions as we can. So take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Bill. That was a great story. I wore that coat for many years after. And I want to say too, thank you everyone for coming. There's a long list of people, many old friends and many names I've heard, and many I haven't. So I'm glad to be here tonight. I want to talk about Ben Salmon, a 28-year-old Catholic layman from Denver, Colorado, when he sent a letter to President Wilson stating that he would refuse conscription into the military. He never heard back from President Wilson, but 6 months later, he did hear from the government when they sent him an army questionnaire for his conscription into the military. And the next day, he hand delivered a letter to his local draft board declaring that he wouldn't answer the questionnaire and stating his reasons. I want to read what he says. He says, "War is incompatible with my conception of Christianity. I positively refuse to aid organized murder. I must serve God first, and in serving God, it is impossible to be other than loyal to my country, which is the world. Let those who believe in wholesale violation of the commandment, thou shalt not kill, make a profession of their faith by joining the army of war. I am in the army of peace, and in this army I intend to live and die." He sent that letter Christmas, the day after Christmas in 1917. For the next 3 years, until his release from military custody on November 25th, 1920, which is in 2 weeks, it'll be the 100th anniversary of his release from custody. Ben Salmon adhered to these principles and served on the front lines in the Army of Peace. My talk tonight will discuss Ben Salmon and his significance, and it'll be divided up into 4 parts. First, the life of Ben Salmon, what happened, when, where, how, and why. 2, what Ben Salmon was up against in the Catholic Church. And then 3, Ben Salmon's Manifesto of Conscience, which he wrote while in custody. And then Ben Salmon and the tradition of Catholic radicalism. So without further ado, let me launch into the first part of my talk, the life of Ben Salmon. Ben Salmon was born on October 15th, 1888 in Denver, Colorado. He was born into an Irish-Canadian immigrant family. Both his parents were Catholic. His mother was especially devout. And in his early teens, after going to the local Catholic grade school, Ben and his brother Joe began working in the Colorado and Southern Railroad. In the next several years, his politics moved leftward. And in Colorado at that time, there was a strong leftist labor movement that he got involved with. He was involved with the radical labor unions such as the Western Federation of Miners, which he believed was the primary vehicle for social change. And he brought his labor convictions into his workplace, taking on the role of an agitator, as he put it. In 1914, in April, National Guardsmen killed a dozen striking coal miners and women and children who were hiding in a striker camp in Ludlow, Colorado. And it became the Ludlow Massacre, and Salmon was outraged by it and then in activism. As a consequence, he lost his job with the railroad. He wrote and distributed flyers calling for different referenda in Denver. He ran in the Colorado State Legislature on a single tax platform. And he was, all this was part of his struggle for justice. In 1914, when the Great War broke out, Ben Salmon didn't hesitate to make his views known. And he published an anti-war article in a newsletter that he edited. And the article was called "Thou Shalt Not Kill." In 1916, Salmon voted for Woodrow Wilson as the presidential candidate who would keep the country out of the war. But 5 months later, President Wilson convened Congress seeking a declaration of war, which Ben Salmon scorned. He scorned Wilson for changing his colors. And then came the law compelling young men to register for the draft. He was told he had to register for the draft. He wrote a letter saying that he registered for the draft but would not further cooperate. And after that, he got his, he received his draft notice on Christmas Day, 1917. And the next day is when he wrote that letter that I started off with, quoted above. to his local draft board. At that time, he was expelled from his parish's chapter of the Knights of Columbus, a Holy Family parish. It's a parish about a mile from where I'm sitting right now. His fate during the next several years can be summarized as follows. On January 5th, 1918, he was arrested and released with a $2,500 bail. On January 7th, he sought legal assistance from the National Civil Liberties Bureau in New York City, but he was turned down. They told him that it was no use fighting, but he fought anyway. On March 30th, 1918, his attorneys argued in court that the Army questionnaire was unconstitutional because it violated their client's First Amendment right to religious freedom. But the case never went anywhere. And on May 20th, he received another draft notice ordering him to report for training, and he refused. So the police came and arrested him, turned him over to military authorities, and they placed him in solitary confinement overnight at Fort Logan, Colorado, just outside of Denver, about a mile from my house. From there, he was sent to Camp Funston, Kansas, to Camp Pawnee, Kansas, to Camp Dodge, Iowa, where he was court-martialed for desertion and distributing propaganda, and he was sentenced to death. Later, the sentence was reduced without explanation to 25 years hard labor. He was transferred again to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas on October 9th, 1918. A month later, the war ended, but Salmon was incarcerated for more than 2 years further. His time at Leavenworth was harsh. After reporting on corruption in the dining hall system, organizing a protest against it, he was placed in solitary confinement for 6 months. In April 1919, he was released from solitary confinement and placed with the other absolutists, as they called them, political leftists or Amish, Mennonite, and Quaker and Jehovah's Witness conscientious objectors. In late June 1919, the group was transferred to Fort Douglas, Utah, where conditions were equally harsh. And for more than a year, Salmon protested the harsh conditions and illegal treatment of conscientious objectors, writing letters to President Wilson, to the Secretary of War, Baker, and to circuit judges, and to lawyers at the American Civil Liberties Union seeking help with a writ of habeas corpus. On July 13th, 1920, he began a hunger strike. 10 days later, near death, he sent for a priest, but the priest refused to hear his confession or give him communion or anoint him on the grounds that his hunger strike was tantamount to suicide, which is a mortal sin. The next day, 2 other priests did come. On July 25th, Ben Salmon was force-fed, and then on July 31st, he was transferred to Washington, D.C., and placed in a wing of St. Elizabeth's Catholic Hospital that was reserved for the criminally insane. By this time, his case was taken up by the ACLU. His name appeared in the New York Times. His cause drew national attention, and prominent churchmen, including Monsignor John Ryan of Catholic University, agreed to help. But it was the ACLU that supplied Salmon with a writ of habeas corpus, and he resolved to take it to the Supreme Court, at which point he was released with 32 other conscientious objectors that remained in custody. On November 25th, 1920, the day after Thanksgiving, he gathered his belongings, he signed his release papers, received a dishonorable discharge, and walked out of military custody, a free man for the first time in 2.5 years. A remarkable witness of conscience and resistance and refusal. And it's even more remarkable if we look at the situation of the Catholic Church at the time. This is the second part of my talk. And the Catholic Church at the time, Catholics they were wary and divided about supporting the war in 1914. But once the nation, the United States, went to war, Catholics, like the population at large, declared their allegiance to the nation and promised their energetic support for the war effort. And nowhere was this more clearly stated than in a letter from Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore, who was the de facto head of the Catholic Church, to President Wilson 12 days after war was declared. This is what Cardinal Gibbons wrote to President Wilson, quote, "We stand ready, we and all the flock committed to our keeping, to cooperate in every way possible with our president and our national government, to the end that the great and holy cause of liberty may triumph and that our beloved country may emerge from this test stronger and nobler than ever. Our people as ever will rise as one man to serve the nation," unquote. That following August of 1917, a group of Catholic laity and clergy met in Washington, D.C., and established the National Catholic War Council. Its purpose was to mobilize the nation's 17 million Catholics to perform war work, as it was called at the time, which included the following: recruiting priests to serve as military chaplains, gathering religious supplies, patens, chalices, hosts, vestments, and so on for the troops, building visitor centers where family and friends could stay when visiting soldiers in training, erecting aid stations for Catholic troops to enjoy healthy recreation, establishing war councils in dioceses and parishes to support the Catholic troops, founding Catholic chapters of the Boy Scouts of America, establishing the Student Army Training Corps programs at Catholic colleges and universities. It's kind of the forerunner of the ROTC programs. Training social workers for post-war relief work, tending to the graves of the fallen Catholic soldiers overseas, and amassing a comprehensive documentary record of all these efforts, which still can be found at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. in their archives. All this and more is presented in a book called American Catholics in the War, the National Catholic War Council, 1917 to 1921, by Michael Williams, who was a staff member of the press department of the War Council. The book vividly shows how and why Catholics in the United States gave their time and their energy, in some cases their lives, in service to the nation during the Great War. It shows how this was done in service of God, of love for God and country, a dual love that shaped the lives and works of Catholics in the past centuries, from the very beginning of the United States right up to the recent war. The book starts with a long standard Catholic history from Christopher Columbus to the founding of Maryland, to the Revolutionary War and the US founding, and to all wars thereafter, when Catholics proved themselves loyal to the nation, including the most recent Great War. Michael Williams was writing in 1921. In the final chapter of the book, he announces that the National Catholic War Council will continue its service to the nation in the post-war period by infusing its public life with sound Christian principles of justice and peace. And for this reason, the War Council was reconstituted as the National Catholic Welfare Council. And later it was renamed the National Catholic Welfare Conference. And now it's called the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, the USCCB. Think of that. The original institutional form of the USCCB was the National Catholic War Council. Michael Williams's book helps us to understand what Ben Salmon faced when he took his stand against the war. Not only was he facing the repressive machinery of a nation state at war, but he was also facing the wrath of a war-making church bent on demonstrating its loyalty and love to America in its time of national crisis. In fact, he was bucking against the past record and the future hopes of an Americanized form of Catholicism, in effect, a nationalized church. So it was all but inevitable that Salmon would be rejected by his fellow Catholics, clergy and laity alike, being expelled from the Knights of Columbus, denied the sacraments by priest chaplains at Fort Douglas in Utah, neglected by church leaders, while he was confined in a ward for the criminally insane until he became a cause celeb around the country and an embarrassment to the church. But in addition to his remarkable witness, we can take inspiration from Ben Salmon's words, especially the words accounting for his conscientious objection to war, which he composed while he was at St. Elizabeth's Catholic Hospital in Washington, D.C. It's a remarkable text, and in the third part of my talk, I want to set forth some of the themes in this text. Ben Salmon wrote his Manifesto of Conscience while at St. Elizabeth's Hospital from early August until November 1920. The text runs for 230 pages, single-spaced, regular font, totaling 130,000 words. He worked on it for several weeks, perhaps even a month or more, but the statement wanders for several reasons. His personal papers were never sent to him from Fort Douglas, so he had to work from memory. He did not have the books he wanted, so he had to ask for them or request them and wait till they arrived. And he thought things through as he wrote, drawing on his personal experience, using analogies to make his points, clarifying his argument in relation to Catholic teaching, and repeatedly rebutting the claim that he suffered from, quote, defective judgment or was insane. This was what he was charged with by the authorities. And yet, even with all these disadvantages, his writing is quite well organized, and he organizes his thoughts along three lines: the political, the humanitarian, and the religious grounds for his conscientious objection. Let's take each of those in turn. Ben Salmon explains the political grounds for his conscientious objection by quoting President Wilson, who said that the Great War was, quote, a commercial war, that the seat of war in the modern world is industrial and commercial rivalry. If this is true, Salmon asked, then who profits? Not, he said, the soldier lads who were paid $30 a month, but the profiteers. In fact, Salmon points out, the World War produced 17 million new millionaires in America, in addition to enhancing the fortunes of those who were already millionaires and producing a large army of near millionaires. That's a quote from Salmon. He also notes that the media depicted America's motives in joining the war as noble and unselfish, for the good of humanity, for democracy. But Salmon points out that, in fact, humanity did not fare so well. Great Britain got more than 1 million square miles of territory after the war, whereas Ireland, Egypt, India, and Persia and other lands received what he calls the yoke of serfdom. Ireland was a special concern for Salmon. He was Irish, after all, and the Irish people voted for self-government during this time. In fact, they rebelled during the war against their English overlords. Salmon writes, England dispatched 200,000 troops to the Emerald Isle, along with, quote, every implement of modern warfare in order to protect the Irish from democracy. The government and the press also misrepresented the war as a war to crush militarism. For the US American Army today, Salmon argues, is 3 times its pre-war size. In 1916, there were 4,000 officers feeding at the public crib. These are Salmon's caustic words. But there are now more than 15,000. And you can see an increase in militarism in France, England, Japan. Every nation on earth except Germany is doubling, tripling, quadrupling their armaments. And the war, Salmon says, was supposedly a war to make future wars impossible. But he notes in his statement, writing in 1920, wars are still being fought today. Greek and British troops are set against the Turks near Constantinople. British troops are operating in Mesopotamia. Arabs are fighting the French. Poland and Russia, and friction between Russia and Austria. All these are instances indicating that militarism is far from being overcome. All of which shows that from the political point of view, says Salmon, there is but one conclusion. War is a good thing for the profiteers, he said. And after noting that the military is also employed against striking workers at home, and he refers to a recent strike in Denver, he moves on to his humanitarian reasons for opposing the war. His humanitarian point is a simple one. He makes it by recalling a lecture on love of country delivered by a Father Orion of Denver, who apparently explained the evolution of love from family to tribe to village to city to state and then to the nation. At each stage, this evolution of peace and harmony was extended, Father Orion argued, so that now we have a nation of people bound together by ties of friendship and reciprocal interest that make for understanding and peace. But Salmon argues the good father stopped at national boundaries. Why? For no good reason, Salmon said. Had he pursued the logic of his illustration, he would have encircled the globe with his philosophy of love. But Father Ryan is like so many of our priests and ministers, unable or unwilling to look beyond the borders of the good old USA. He is a patriot, and so it is with leaders of Christianity in other countries. So Salmon points out that Catholics in America were nationalized, as were Catholics in the other countries, England, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and so on. Salmon says that you can expand the love ethic to all nations, and he admits that it sounds idealist, but he also says that the airplane, which was recently invented, sounded idealistic too, until it was invented and until it worked. And he said artists are idealists, but they're important for human progress, so that his idealistic stand is also important for human progress. So much for the humanitarian grounds. The religious grounds are really the decisive ones for Ben Salmon and his opposition to war. And his religious grounds take up 180 pages, 80% of his statement. And we can divide them up into arguments, into positive arguments and negative arguments, arguments for and against, pro and contra. And they run like this. If you are a Christian, Salmon writes, this is a quote, listen to the voice of Christ echoed from the pages of the New Testament. While he acknowledges that war was sometimes permitted in the Old Testament, he insists that, quote, we are Christians and we must do what Christ said. And there is not one instance since the dawn of Christianity where Christians were ordered by God to go to war. On the contrary, all Christ's teaching prohibit not only war, but also its incident, hatred, anger, etc. The Sermon on the Mount figures prominently in Ben Salmon's statement, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. And to the argument that the passages in the Sermon on the Mount were only admonitions of Jesus. This is what a chaplain told him at Camp Funston, and not commandments. Salmon counters that Jesus wanted us to live all, not part of his doctrine, but all of it. In other words, he's questioning the slippery distinction between the binding precepts and the evangelical counsels. He says the gospel is for everyone. It's kind of thinking ahead to the universal call to holiness of Vatican II. He also repeatedly cites Romans 12, Paul's instruction never to render evil for evil, which he argues we do all the time in ordinary life. We overcome lies with truth, sickness with health, anger with meekness, pride with humility. So the way to overcome the evil of war is by the good of peace, Salmon says, a steadfast refusal to render evil for evil. Overcoming evil by doing good, as Salmon sees it, he says this is Christianity in a nutshell. His arguments against, his arguments contra, focus on the official teaching of the church on taking life. And most of all, they focus on an article in the recently published Catholic Encyclopedia titled simply War, which was authored by Reverend Charles Maxey, S.J., professor of ethics and natural right at the Gregorian University in Rome. He copied out the article in its entirety, right out of the pages of the Catholic Encyclopedia, more than 10 pages of single-spaced typescript, 479 lines of all, each numbered for easy referencing. And then he methodically rebuts the article point by point, returning again and again to his principle that evil can only be overcome by doing good. This injunction and the related ones in the Sermon on the Mount, said Salmon, pertain not only to individuals, but also to nations. Otherwise, how could we make sense of Jesus's commission to the apostles to go forth and baptize all nations? Moreover, he argues, the state must recede in cases when its laws conflict with divine law. Let me read a quote from Salmon here. He writes, "Man is interior to the state. Since God has forbidden him to kill, the state cannot confer the right to kill, and therefore the power to order its citizens to slaughter their fellow men is not vested with the state. God alone can issue such an order. Either Christ is a liar or war is never necessary. And very properly assuming that Christ told the truth, it follows that the state is without," quote, he's quoting Father Maxey here, "judicial authority to determine when war is necessary, because," Salmon continues, "it is never necessary." Time and again in his statement, Salmon overturns the philosophical categories used by Maxey by recasting them theologically. Natural law is defined in terms of the law of nature whose author is God. The natural tribunal of the state is supplanted by the supernatural tribunal. Justice is the freedom to act to one's final end, which is knowing and loving and worshiping God. So that Salmon continually rebuts the official church teaching with his understanding of the supernatural life of Christ. Likewise, he says, self-preservation, according to Maxey, his opponent, is a duty of the natural law. But Salmon counters and says, yes, but we enact self-preservation with spiritual and intellectual weapons. So the chief point that Salmon returns to is that Christ is the Son of God, and that all terms and categories must align, must be gravitationally pulled in alignment with this fundamental doctrinal truth, including all categories pertaining to just killing. There's no such thing, he argues, as a just war. In other words, the notion of a just war invites self-deception, just as the notion of just stealing or just adultery or just intoxication would invite self-deception. And so Salmon wants to argue that the purpose of God is to use his followers to overcome evil with good. And this really sums up his point of view. And it's a remarkable, remarkable document. There's so much more to say, but I'll leave it there and continue with the fourth part of my talk, which refers to Ben Salmon and the Catholic radical tradition. After his release in 1920, Ben Salmon moved to Chicago. He was later joined by his wife, Elizabeth, and their son, Charles. He had a second child born soon, Margaret, and then a third, Geraldine, who is signed up for this talk tonight, Sister Elizabeth, the Maryknoll sister. And then a fourth child, Michael, who died in childhood. And Salmon eventually took a job at the Lindbergh Airport in Chicago. He couldn't get another job, a good job, because of his dishonorable discharge from the military. And in 1931, he contracted pneumonia and never recovered, and he died at home on February 15th, 1932. And his story, Ben Salmon's story, lived on in the hearts and the minds and the books and memoirs of other anti-war activists and scholars. Norman Thomas, for example, in his book, The Conscientious Objector in America, noted that Salmon's hunger strike was the most dramatic event of the imprisonment of the objectors in the latter days of the war. Ammon Hennessy, in his biography, The Book of Ammon, recalled telling a group of Catholic workers in Chicago in 1937 that he himself had visited Ben Salmon at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And he pointed out that Ben Salmon was a Catholic, a single taxer, a vegetarian, and he befriended the guard who was force feeding him during his hunger strike and converted the guard to pacifism. Around this time, the Catholic Worker introduced to their readership the story of Ben Salmon with a photo and excerpts from his writings, his letters to President Wilson. That was in 1937. And then again in 1942, the Catholic Worker featured Ben Salmon's open letter to President Wilson, which Ben Salmon wrote in October of 1919, but the Catholic Worker was publishing it in the context of the Second World War. Gordon Zahn saw the reprint of Ben Salmon's story when he was at Camp Simon during the war as a conscientious objector. After the war, Gordon Zahn studied sociology at Catholic U under Father Paul Hanley Furphy and went on to write several important books on war, peace, and conscientious objection, including German Catholics and Hitler's Wars, and In Solitary Witness, the story of Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian Catholic who refused to participate in Nazi-controlled military and was martyred in 1943. Decades later, Gordon Zahn suggested to a graduate student in Boston that he should try to find information on Ben Salmon. And the fruit of Zahn's suggestion is Torrin Finney's book, The Unsung Hero of the Great War. Here's a copy of the book right here. And through this book, Salmon's story became more widely known among Catholic pacifists and anti-war activists and scholars. Daniel Berrigan, the Jesuit priest, poet, and peace activist, wrote a meditation about him. Bob Ellsberg included an entry on Salmon in his book, All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time. The Catholic Peace Fellowship featured an article on him in 2007, including an interview with his daughter, Sister Elizabeth Salmon, in its journal, The Sign of Peace. And now, almost a century after Salmon's refusal, there is an effort underway among Catholic peace activists, friends of Franz and Ben, to argue for the possible canonization of Ben Salmon in the Catholic Church. At the very least, this group maintains Ben Salmon should be named by the Church alongside Dorothy Day as a servant of God. And what this trajectory indicates is that the Ben Salmon story is more than a single story of faith, conscience, and anti-war activism, but it's also the inauguration of a tradition of faith, conscience, and anti-war activism, or better yet, a counter tradition, one that counters the dominant Americanist tradition of Catholic thought in the United States. And the central claim of the Americanist tradition is that the United States is a divinely chosen instrument through which the church can bring it, fulfill its mission to all nations. But what Salmon does is he offers a counterpoint to this tradition. This Americanist tradition was stoutly challenged by Salmon in his conscientious objection to the Great War and in his writings, especially his Manifesto of Conscience that he wrote at St. Elizabeth's. It's a groundbreaking combination of traditional Catholicism and political radicalism, and it forges an intellectual basis for Catholic pacifism that would be developed in the generations that follow. And I think of many people of yesterday and today who follow in that tradition. Gordon Zahn, the Berrigans, Jim Forrest, Tom Cornell, Bill Offenloch, Jim Douglas, Kathy Kelly, Joshua Castile, Brian Terrell, and especially the Kings Bay's plowshares, several of whom are getting sentenced this week. And we need to look at them in the context of what Ben Salmon lays out in his Manifesto of Conscience. Let me close with a quote from Ben. Today we find the scene that preceded Christ's death reenacted. When he began to become unpopular, his prophecy that all would be scandalized by him came true. One denied him, another betrayed him, all the disciples fled. And so it is today in the question of wholesale murder. Christian ministers and priests are betraying him to the hands of the profiteers. Others, not quite so brazen, are denying him. Still others are fleeing in fear and trembling because of the government's secret service and the unfavorable publicity by the newspapers and the hysteria of the mob. How very few of God's ambassadors occupy the only pulpit that a Christian minister can honestly occupy in a time of war, a prison cell. So here we have Salmon absorbing the events of his time and place into the scriptural narrative and showing us and the cloud of witnesses who came after that we too can take our positions on the front lines in the army of peace. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mike. That was terrific. That was really rich. A lot to think about there, and it's clearly not just history, but incredibly relevant to where we're at today. So I want to take you back a little bit first and fill in a little bit of the history, and then we'll kind of bring it up to the present and talk about some of the present ramifications of what you've just said. In the 19th century, Catholics were known as bad Americans, right? We were suspected of obeying a foreign potentate and, dressing funny and drinking too much and being undemocratic and unsuited to blend into America. And some of these accusations were not without reason, right? There was a whole battalion in the Mexican army in the Mexican War made up of deserters, Catholic deserters from the US Army who thought they should better fight for the Catholics rather than fight for the Americans, which is really a kind of remarkable story. Mostly Irish, right? But for whom their Catholic identity was more important than their American identity. And then you've got us up to World War I, where that's a very different story. Could you say a little bit how we got from there to the National Catholic? How do you get from the St. Patrick's Battalion in the Mexican Army to the National Catholic War Council in the Great War?
Well, it's that same dynamic of an immigrant group coming into the United States. And I suppose it would be true that some would be so alienated from the United States, they'd want to fight against it. But most Catholics in the 19th century felt that they wanted to stay and become American, and the best way to prove their Americanism. And that's the way they talked. They said, you have to prove your Americanism,
Mm.
especially during wartime, especially during wartime. And at the time of World War I, two of the largest groups in the United States were very suspect for on the question of their loyalty. The Irish, because they were reluctant to ally themselves, one might think, to any cause that was allied with their oppressor, England.
Mm.
And the Germans, who maintained their customs and their language and their culture, especially in the Midwest, and they retained their German identity. So they were very suspect. But what happened at the time of World War I is that they shucked off those prior national identities to embrace this new national identity of Americans, so that the Catholics really bend over backwards to prove their loyalty. And this pattern really continues throughout most of the 20th century. World War I was a turning point, according to historians, but it also it was also true in the Second World War. The Vietnam War becomes different. Catholics begin to dissent in large numbers, but yeah, it was precisely the immigrant anxiety of not belonging and trying to prove that you're an American that really was operative, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. So let's talk a little bit about the current context. I mean, there's part of this story in some ways is hard to relate to now because there's no draft, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very easy for people like us, most of the people serving in the military is an all volunteer military. Most of the people are, not college educated. And it's very easy for people like us to support conscientious objection when it doesn't cost us anything. Can you say a little bit about that? How is Ben Salmon's message relevant in times of an all volunteer army?
Well, it is true. I tell my students this all the time. I usually in my classes, I reenact a draft. And I ask kids for their birthdays and draw ping pong balls and everything and say, people used to look in the paper to find out where they were in the draft and whether they're likely to be drafted. And if that were going on today, kids, you'd be thinking a lot more about war than you probably do now. But, it is relevant in this sense. A lot of people join the military and then have conscience qualms once they're in the military. And in fact, I suppose you could say, to the credit of the military, there are laws and regulations allowing people to seek conscientious objector status when they're in the military, if they can prove that they've had a change of conscience after they signed their enlistment contract. And it turns out that many people in the military do have these changes of conscience. And in that sense, I think it's really important to think of, an example like Ben Salmon, simply because he was in military custody for years. And so this story can be very relevant to military conscientious objectors. And also, I think Ben Salmon's witness and what he has to say about war is important, especially in light of recruitment efforts on the part of the military when they come into Catholic high schools or public high schools and just try to sell students on a career in the military when they might be sold a bill of goods. In the Catholic Peace Fellowship, we used to work with people in the military, and they all said, my recruiter promised me this, that, and the other, and it never came to pass. And I found out the military was much more they'll say more violent than I thought it would be. You want to say, what were you thinking? But they really are shocked by some of the things that in their training and so on. And so even now with the all volunteer force, which has been in effect since say 1976, it's still true that conscientious objection in the military is relevant today. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Let me kind of follow up on that. There's a few questions in the chat that are relevant to, not the chat, but the question and answer. Are a few questions coming in, and it also has about just war. And there's a few questions that I want to ask you about that and explore that a little bit too.
Okay.
So you talked about conscientious objection, but there's also selective conscientious objection, right? The idea that you might fight in some wars, but not other wars that are considered to be unjust. And some of there's one person in the chat who's asking about how could you have an army of peace without an army of service? The idea that you can, in fact, serve in the military honorably and necessarily. And then someone else asking about just war and taking a very different tact on it and saying, should the Catholic Church declare that the just war theory is no longer valid? Can we go the route of what people are calling a kind of just peace movement and move beyond that? So there's a lot of different positions on this. It seems that the church has not quite made up its mind. You've got support for pacifists, you've got support for just war theory as well. And it seems in some way that even just taking the just war theory could be quite radical if you took it seriously. You know, you might have people in the Iraq War, you know, if they had listened to Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger during the Iraq War, they might have stayed away in droves, you know, just on the basis of the just war theory and not pacifism. So anyway, lots of different things to unpack there.
Let me give just a couple of comments. One about Ben Salmon. Ben Salmon said, there is no animal, this is how he puts it, there's no animal called the just war. There's not such a thing. If you look at the teaching of Christ, it's just obvious. Just war is ruled out. Now, it's interesting, you know, and I remember one time asking in a group of people here in Denver, where did he get that from? And I remember Sister Anna Koop, who might even be here tonight, said, what do you mean? He got it from the gospel. That's where he got it from. He didn't have to do any research or read books other than the gospel. So there's that. That's certainly true. It's interesting in Salmon's statement, though. It becomes apparent as you read, he has never read anything of Aquinas, anything of the natural law tradition, and anything of the just war tradition beyond this article, which he thinks is utter nonsense. So he's really just flat out rejects it. And there's obviously a movement. Dorothy Day was the same way and so on. And yet it also is true, I would like to suggest that just war theory can be used as not as a justification of war, an easy justification for nationalistic wars, but also as a standard of resistance to war as well. And so we do have a record of people who are selective conscientious objectors who refuse to participate in Iraq, the Iraq War. Camilo Mejia was a great conscientious objector, and he said this war is unjust. That's what he arrived at as his conclusion. And the same was true during Vietnam. And if you look in the history of the anti-nuclear movement, a lot of the nuclear weapon, the campaign for nuclear disarmament in England in the 50s and 60s was based on just war thinking. They said these weapons are indiscriminate and they can't ever be used justly. So we have to resist nuclear weapons. So it is true that just war tradition can be used to resist modern war. In fact, I would argue, I know people will disagree with this, but I would argue that Jägerstätter was kind of in effect a kind of just war thinker. He would have probably fought in resistance to the Nazis if Austria decided to resist the Nazis, but he certainly wasn't going to fight in an army that was controlled by the Nazis. That's a big bone of contention. I'm sure there are people writing in arguing this as I speak. So, and today we have this idea to dispense of the just war theory. This is a big move. I don't know if that's going to happen, to be honest. I know this is a bone of contention and so on. I don't think the church is going to simply dispense with the just war tradition. Now, I think what Francis wants to do is make the just war tradition less the normative position and to replace it with gospel nonviolence, and then make the just war tradition more of a fringe thought. Now, I think that there's some possibility of that, but I don't foresee an outright denunciation of Catholic teaching on just war. And to be honest, I think one reason is that I think Pope Francis is not an absolute pacifist. He has said at some points, well, there are times when you can go to war and so on. So I favor using what we have, both traditions, just the strict just war tradition and the pacifist tradition, to resist modern war.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
One of the comments or questions in the question is about Fratelli Tutti, in which Pope Francis seems to say that just war is no longer valid. And person's just looking for you to comment on that, but I think you already have. I mean, one way to think of it too is this. People are looking, the way that John Paul II dispensed with the death penalty was to say that perhaps in principle it might be valid, but that its conditions for its moral use are practically non-existent. And I think the church in general has moved in that direction in this century, this past century. And to be honest, it's the peace movement thinkers that I listed toward the end of my talk, who I think have pushed the church's moral thinking in that direction. Speaking of those thinkers, someone wanted to give a shout out to Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy.
Hey, Charlie McCarthy, are you there?
Yeah, so little shout out there. Couple other one point on the chat that people wanted to point out is that St. Elizabeth's Hospital in DC is not Catholic.
Actually, thank you for that. That was probably Stephen Smith. He's always correcting me on that.
Well, Jack Gilroy does a little mea culpa and says that he might have been responsible for that error. So anyway, you can take that up with Jack later. St. Elizabeth's is the place where the guy who shot Ronald Reagan on Jodie Foster's orders is located, I think. Anyway,
Ezra Pound ended up there too. Ezra Pound.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because I know guys in Holy Cross that used to visit him.
Is that right?
Master work. Yeah. It's connections.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about, so you talked about this kind of alternative radical tradition in Catholicism as opposed to the Americanist tradition. So how do you understand that radical tradition in today's political context, given what the election and everything that we just went through?
Man, that's a tough question. I started thinking about these two traditions in the wake of the challenge of peace, where they kind of say there's two alternatives when it comes to war, pacifism and just war. And then Ron Mustow put out a book through Orbis Press called The Catholic Peace Tradition. And he said, well, here's the Catholic peace tradition. He lays it out. It's a great book. And so you get this idea of two traditions competing against each other. But at the time of the challenge of peace, here's what was the complementing factor. And I'm going to get to your question of today by looking back at this. At the time of the challenge of peace, there was a big debate between liberals and conservatives as to what should be said in the letter in regard to the Reagan administration. But both liberals and conservatives, liberals like Brian Hare, like David Hollenbach, and conservatives like Michael Novak and so on, they both agreed that you had to have nuclear weapons. And even though they had a very ferocious debate during the 80s and then in the years after, they both fell into what I would argue was this Americanist tradition. And the clearest example of that, clearest evidence of that, is they both thought that John Courtney Murray was the thinker to go to. Now, if you look at this liberalism and conservatism as two wings of the Americanist tradition, what you see with people like Ben Salmon and Dorothy Day is a tradition, a radical tradition that calls into question the very construct that says, here's our two alternatives, liberalism and conservatism. And these have remained remarkably stable for the last 50 years. And what we have are new forms in the present context of these old traditions. Now, you could say the Republican conservative tradition is breaking down, and they certainly are going through a lot of rethinking, you know, their principles and so on. But, you know, the Republican Party is Americanist in its, you could say this new populism or this new nationalism. And yet we have now Joe Biden and the Democrats back into office. But if you just think back 10 years ago, there was a lot to complain about when Obama was president. I mean, he enhanced the drone operations around the world, engaging in wars everywhere. And so we have these two forms, these two alternatives that were given. And in election time, we think that one is going to save the country from the other, when in fact, both traditions are at their most insightful when they critique each other, but they both fall within the Americanist tradition as I understand it. And what Salmon does is come at the politics from a much more radical position of the old left, where he doesn't fall prey to these kind of conventional political alternatives that we get served up to us as, you know, you have to take the lesser of two evils, or all this nonsense. And so this radical political tradition, and that's being given, it's given voice with, I would say some people connected to The Intercept, people like Jeremy Scahill, Glenn Greenwald, some kind of like radical journalists, critical journalists, certain people in the Black Marxist movement and so on, are calling into question the Democrats as well as Republicans. And I think that this is a time when we need to be aware of being co-opted into mainstream Democratic politics of liberalism, which will argue that we have to dispense with more radical social programs and so on.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you know, speaking of that, there's a question that's come up about Salmon's work with unions and his support for the single tax, and someone asking if you could talk a little bit more about Salmon's economic and political ideas other than his ideas of war. It all obviously is interrelated, and someone would like you to follow up on that.
I'd love to do that, because I skipped this part in my talk because I felt like you were about to tell me to shut up, Bill. And so I thought I better skip this stuff. And I know I went on too long, but
I've been on the verge of telling you to shut up for years.
For the last 30 years. No, but this is an interesting question, and it's an interesting part of Salmon's life. Salmon was a reader and a follower of Henry George's Progress and Poverty, which took up which articulated the single tax clause. And it was a national movement arguing that economic injustice could be rectified by imposing a steep land tax, compelling corporations and landowners, especially wealthy landlords, to sell off their large holdings, thus enabling the working classes to buy homes and provide for their families. And Salmon really was involved with, he started a newsletter called The Single Tax in Denver, and that's where he published some of his anti-war stuff. And he even ran in the House of Representatives as on the single tax ticket. He didn't get elected or anything. But the movement was really important as a kind of radical imposition of government control over inordinate wealth. I think that the analogy today would be that it would be like taxing internet usage. I mean, just think if we all got taxed for how much we use the internet. And so the single taxer movement and actually the labor movement in Colorado at this time was very powerful. You know, in the late 19th century, there were mining wars, fierce struggles between miners, strike breakers, hired guns, Cripple Creek, the Cripple Creek War, the Leadville War, the Telluride War. These are in like the 1890s and the early 20th century. So that there was this really radical leftist, almost, well, they were kind of like the Wobblies that formed in 1905. And Salmon was involved with these people. He really thought that social change would come primarily through unions. Which is such a great thought if you think about it today. And the mentality is best portrayed in the movie Maitland, which is about the coal mining wars of West Virginia back in 1920. And the Wobblies, and they were, of course, a big influence on Peter Morton and Dorothy Day. So these connections are very real. And I don't know if that helps in answering that question, but the single tax movement was powerful at the time.
Yeah.
Forgotten now.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen a few articles recently about it. It's a kind of tax on property, like tax on land rather than tax on income. And it has kind of some pretty interesting ramifications.
Yeah. Yeah.
So before I ask you another question, we've got a few more shout outs here.
I just saw a message from Art Laughing. Hi, Art. I love you.
Art Laughing says that he shared information about Ben Salmon with Cardinal Turkson and asked him to hand it on to Pope Francis. And so if we ever convince Pope Francis to write an encyclical on gospel nonviolence, hopefully he will give a shout out to Ben Salmon, as he did to Dorothy Day, of course, when he talked to Congress, when he gave that talk to the U.S. Congress a few years ago. There's a shout out from the Kings Bay Plowshare 7 from Robert Cushing saying, "We're right with you." And there's also one from Sheila Miranda, who says, "I am Ben Salmon's oldest great-granddaughter. Granddaughter of his daughter Margaret from St. Louis." And she said, "Let me clarify, I'm from St. Louis, not my grandmother Margaret. My mother is her oldest daughter from Denver." So delighted to have you along with us as well.
She should definitely contact us. I'd love to talk with her by phone.
Okay, terrific.
Seriously, if we could do that, that would be great.
Yeah. We have another question about, a couple of questions actually about Ben's family life in the years after he was released from prison, 1920 to 1923. He's working in Chicago at the airport and so on. What do we know about this time becoming a family? Did he give talks? What was his relationship to the local church? and so on. So question from Christopher Spicer Hankel about that time.
That's a question that I don't know if I'm the best one to answer it, but my guess is that Steve Smith, a guy in New York who knows everything about Ben Salmon, would have the best evidence about this. What I could do is venture a theory I have, which was this. I think Ben Salmon's witness caused tension in his marriage. And there's even on record a divorce decree in Denver indicating, a break of some sort. But then it seems that it got patched up. I think his family, his wife's family, didn't want him to come back to Denver. He was Denver's notorious slacker. That's how the New York Times wrote about him. It was just unbelievable. And the Denver Post was just incredibly vicious toward him. But the family did migrate to Chicago. And my guess is maybe to keep peace in the marriage, that he toned down his anti-war activism. I get the sense that, well, one, they had 4 kids. We all know what that can get like. And I think it was a hard life is the sense I get.
Yeah.
And then when the Depression hit, he had a hard time getting a job. And that was only 9 years after he was released. And he was, and they had 4 kids. They had one when he was in custody, but then the other 3 later. So I get the sense that they really had a tough time. And he certainly fades from the picture. Here's my thinking about this, though, or my query. Anyone who knows this, I'd be interested in it. How did Dorothy Day find out about him, is my question. And I don't know the answer to that right now. I have a theory that Ammon Hennessy might have told her, but Ammon talked about Ben Salmon in Chicago years before he ended up at the Catholic Worker. Or Ben was in contact with people that Dorothy knew in New York. And maybe Dorothy heard about Ben Salmon's trials and tribulations before she even converted to the Catholic Church, and she remembered it. That's something for, that historians track down, that I suppose if I do my job, I have to track down. Anyway.
Okay, so let me just say we're about at 8:15 now. Feel, if you all need to leave, feel free to go ahead. There will be a survey that pops up as you leave, and we'd appreciate it if you gave us feedback on that. But I think we could probably go for another 15 minutes or so till 8:30, and people can stick around if you can to chat some more. So
can we get some wine and cheese at this point? And
feel free,
Now I'm in my office. I don't have a.
So one more shout out from Sheila Miranda's mom is here as well, Elizabeth Moore from St. Louis. So thanks for coming as well. It's delightful to see so many of Ben's relatives here.
Living links. These are living links.
Living links, exactly. And of course, a lot of people here are part of that kind of living legacy of Catholic radicalism that you talked about. And that leads me to the next question, which kind of amalgamates several different questions that we've gotten, which is basically how do we move the institutional church and some of the other institutions like the Catholic Theology Society of America to recognize Ben Salmon, put forward the canonization process. How do we convince the Archdiocese of Chicago to really get behind the canonization process? A question, which do you consider to be the most effective way to transform our church leaders and our community's stance toward nuclear deterrence? Education and dialogue or prophetic confrontation? So a lot of these kinds of questions. Where do we go now? What do we do now? How do we move the needle on this, both in the church and in society?
Well, one thing is, I guess I want to say this at the first instance is the best way is to go parish by parish by parish, school by school, like to do the kind of grunt work of telling this story as compellingly as we can, and to spread the word. Now, there's a group in Denver that I've been involved with, and I got too busy and I didn't, but they want to go to parishes and tell this story. It's a compelling and interesting story. And students would love to hear it. In fact, my stepdaughter, Ellen, she goes to Mullen High School, and right next to Mullen High School is Fort Logan. And I swear to God, there's like 10,000 grave sites there. And that's where Ben Salmon was held for a night. I should go to Mullen High School and tell this story and get a presentation all together. That type of thing. All sorts of media is really powerful. Occasions like this, to spread the word. Now, here's my own view of this. The story needs to be told no matter what happens. Because it's a story of resisting war and of being a peacemaker, and whether or not Ben is canonized is secondary to just telling the story and inviting people into the tradition that Ben inaugurates. So that's one thing to think about. When you say prophetic action or education, well, I'm for both. And prophetic action is educational in so many ways. When I tell my students to read The Challenge of Peace, glaze goes over their eyes. When I tell my students, I got arrested in Davis Mountain Air Force Base in 1983, protesting nuclear weapons, they're kind of riveted. So, but that's educational too. So in a way, it's false to say one or the other. The question is to try to get more effective at both. Plus this, that I don't want to lose sight of, the pastoral care of people in the military. I had a student at Notre Dame. She was an Air Force officer. She wrote me when I was working with the Catholic Peace Fellowship. I had her in my war law and ethics class. And she said, they want me to sign a statement saying that I will, if commanded, will follow through orders on turning the launch key. I won't do it. I want to be in the Air Force. I'm an officer. But if I won't sign the statement, I won't get promoted. And in the Air Force, if you don't get promoted, you're out. What do I do? And I said, well, you have to go to your commander and take the stand. And she did. And it's a remarkable witness. And people like that in the military, we need to be attentive to people in these concrete conscience situations as well. So there is a pastoral aspect to this.
Yeah.
What else?
I want to bring one interesting comment into the conversation here. We have a question from Greece. Nikos Kosmides says, greetings from Greece. It is a joy to join you on this day of remembrance of the pain and death caused by World War I. Of course, it's not an accident that we're doing this on November 11th. And he asks a question about the so-called military saints in the life of the Western and the Eastern Church. And he points out that in the Orthodox context, the veneration of military saints is still very vivid, a fact that he relates to the ethnocentricity of church life. So he's wondering what would the recognition of Ben Salmon's sanctity mean in relation to these military saints?
You know, within the communion of saints, you can have disagreements. And I think if you look carefully, you'll see that part of the communion of saints will include arguments about what it means to follow Christ. I mean, everyone's enjoying the beatific vision, but the conversations continue. And I think that Ben Salmon is a kind of critique and a challenge to that tradition. Now, what to do with that? Do you hold both? Or do you emphasize one and try to reconfigure the other in terms of it? I guess I would say that. St. Louis the King, Louis the Ninth of France, he was supposedly a very pious and holy man, but he was involved in calling for the Crusades. Ben would say, as I read, no one has been commanded by God to go to war. So I think that we have, even in the communion of saints, a tradition of conflict and disagreement. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we do need to give voice to what Ben is saying, because he really does capture not just the soldier saints, but also the soldier martyrs who left the military because of its idolatrous practices, and also because of the violence. Because they were, we talk about nationalism, we talked about this earlier, is the worship of false gods, idolatry. I know you're working on this theme, and it's really, Ben Salmon puts that forth for us. I think he really does.
And with the kind of resurgence of nationalism with Trump and Putin and Orban and Modi in India and on, Bolsonaro in Brazil, this theme of nationalism as idolatry gets more relevant all the time. You know, we were told in the 90s that the nation state was going away, that globalization was making all these borders irrelevant, and just turned out not to be so. I want to be sure and mention bensalmon.org. That's where the Jack Gilroy reminds us of that. That's where there's a petition and a letter to Cardinal Cupich looking for more signatures to send to Cardinal Cupich to kind of get this process of canonization for Ben Salmon going. So please visit bensalmon.org and add your name to the petition if you haven't already done so. So we have just a little bit of time left for maybe another question or two. Mike, did you want to?
Yeah, I have one that I want to get out there, just because I was in a conversation. Abraham Nussbaum of the famous Nussbaum family of Colorado is here tonight. And I think his sister Mia is here too. But Abraham asked about the issue. He's a doctor, psychiatric doctor at Denver Health. And he asked about conscientious objection in medicine. And I think that that's a really important concern that is often overlooked. But you know, when we were publishing The Sign of Peace, one of our issues in the Catholic Peace Fellowship in 2009 or 2008 was called From the Battlefield to the Medical Field. And the issues of conscience which come up in medicine, and I think there are more and more that are going to come up, are really important to draw these connections and to just be supportive of people in conscience in both areas. And I think it's true in business and law as well.
Yeah. A couple reminders that today is the feast of Martin of Tours. Speaking of military saints, right, of those who were in the military and became conscientious objectors. And I also want to ask, maybe, and this might be a good question to end on, but it's pretty clear that if peace is going to break out, then this is going to be God's work and not ours. And sometimes we, you know, as activists, we forget that truth. So someone, Terrence Moran asks, did any particular tradition of spirituality influence Ben Salmon? And I wonder if you could say a little bit about his prayer life, his spirituality, if there's any one particular kind of Catholic tradition that he was influenced by.
That's a good question. And I kind of draw a blank at that. He certainly read devotional literature of a standard kind. I don't know if we could put him in line with, say, John Hugo and the Jesuit Quietists and Lallemand and all these, people from the past. But I do want to say this. I think that Ben Salmon, when he made his witness, ended up in military prison side by side with a lot of Anabaptists, and they read the Bible all the time. This is my theory. They read the Bible all the time and talked about it all the time. And this really fortifies Salmon in his witness, and it also makes him remarkably articulate in explaining how important it is to trust God over all worldly powers. So I think it really is very gospel centered. I don't think he was reading Therese de Lisieux or anything like that. I should review this massive text and see, but I'm working on publishing this thing. I want to edit it and get it out there, just because it really is. Here's what I want to say too. It's one of the remarkable pieces of prison literature in American history. It really is a remarkable text. Anyway.
Wow. That brings us to 8:30. If we were sitting around with a couple glasses of beer, we could talk about this for all night long. I would love that, but I think we need to respect people's times and draw this to a close. But I just want to say there are more questions on the Q&A that we just did not have time to get to, and I'm sorry for the folks that put up questions and I couldn't get to them. I'm sorry also for the questions that I asked anonymously and didn't give you credit for, so please forgive me for that. But I want to thank everybody that's been involved with putting this together. Karen Kraft and Marlon Aguilar at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul have really put in a lot of work on this. I want to thank Jack Gilroy and Bernie Serville especially for being the inspiration behind this and pushing to get this done. And I know there's a lot of other folks in this kind of global network of the Catholic Peace Movement that should be thanked as well. Mike, is there anybody that you want to give a shout out to before we thank you?
I want to give a shout out to someone who's not here, Tom Cornell, who I talked with on the way over. And he certainly falls in this tradition. He is a co-founder, co-director of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. I also want to say this. I don't know if people know this, but 299 people signed up for this thing tonight. This is just unbelievable. It made me nervous as hell. And speaking into the void is not easy for me. But I want to say this. We should get this mailing list and try to raise money and get some people who really know what they're doing to put out a good 45-minute film about Ben Salmon. And there's been some great efforts made on the bensalmon.org website, but we need to build on this now. The interest is just remarkable, and the stories need to be told. It really to tell this story is to become a part of it, and the power is really real. And this was great. It's fun.
Sister Peg Donovan, Mary Knoll, sister, in the Q&A says, has a movie been made about this? This really ought to happen. So yeah, I mean, Terrence Malick has done one on Franz Jägerstätter. Maybe he will do one on Ben as well. Get the whole Franz and Ben thing going on. We got the Franz, now we need the Ben movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who's going to star in it, do you think?
I don't know. I'm not good on casting. I'm
Seth,
good on,
not Seth Rogen. Let's
I'm
just.
better on scripts.
So everybody, please join me in thanking Mike. I don't know if there's a way to do this or not, but everybody at home, raise a glass to Mike.
Email me.
Put your hands together. Thank you. This has been terrific.
This has been remarkable. Remarkable.
So yeah, thank you so much, Mike. Great to see you.
Thank you too, dude. See you
Take
soon.
care.